Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kate Gonzalez. I work at the People's Forum as an editor for 1804 Books. If you haven't heard of us before, we are a political and political, cultural, community education center based in New York City, but of course we host virtual events as you are tuning in tonight. So we invite you all to take part in the program we've got. We've got online courses, we have movie screenings. We're invested in educating people about working class struggles all over the world and how we can liberate ourselves everywhere. And in that vein, that is why we're very excited to be partnering with Monthly Review for tonight's book talk, Communes or Nothing, Communes Against Capitalism. And, as people who are invested in study, we're not just reading books to learn more and think, oh, that's so interesting. We're trying to build a better world for ourselves and for everyone so that we can all live full, dignified lives. And communes are one way of imagining a world outside of capitalism, imagining an alternative where people can care for each other in new ways that aren't linked to profit, that aren't linked to the destruction of the world. Before I hand it off to Sierra and all of the amazing panelists we have today, I just want to give a quick pitch for an ongoing campaign we have called Shut It Down for Palestine. It is an amazing resource for people all across the country who want to get involved, who want to hit the streets to protest against the terrible atrocities we're seeing unfold at the hands of the Zionist state of Israel and backed by the US and of all of the other Western empires. So even if you are in New York, we have an action tomorrow at 3 p.m. at Foley Square. I should have checked that before, but I believe it's 3 p.m. at Foley Square. But even if I'm incorrect, you can double check me at shutitdownforpalestine.org. And if you're not in New York, it's going to have actions happening all across the country. So we hope you get engaged. We hope you get involved and help us build a better world for everybody else. And I mean that in a really concrete sense. I'll pass it over to Sierra, who will take us away for the rest of the event. But thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And thank you to all of the panelists. And thank you to Monthly Review.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you so much to the People's Forum and, of course, to Monthly Review, which organized this event, Commune or Nothing, Communes Against Capitalism. Basically, tonight we are going to examine the commune and communal organizing as part of the project for revolutionary transition. And thank you also to our speakers, to our panelists tonight. We have Kali Akuno, Bellamy Foster, Chris Gilbert, and Amy O'Brien. I am Cira Pascual Marquina. I'm part of the Venezuela analysis team, and I'm also a teacher at the Pluriversidad, which is El Panal Communes educational initiative. I will talk briefly about our theme because, of course, we are here to hear about from our panelists. But basically, our objective is to learn about the commune from both a theoretical and a practical perspective, right? So how we trace a path to be collectively emancipated, how we put the commune back into communism, that would be also one of our objectives. And so the speakers will address how communes can be used to abolish the capitalist logic, which is based, of course, on exploitation of the human beings and expropriation of nature. And also we will look at the commune as a mechanism to overcome the range of oppressions that exist in a capitalist society, including racial, gender, sexual, and colonial. The talk is called Commune or Nothing, Comuna or Nada, precisely because recently Chris Gilbert, who is among our panelists, he recently published a book with Monthly Review by that name. Commune or Nothing is a reference to Chavez's 2012. In 2012, Chavez, after already having proposed the commune in 2009 as the strategic objective of the Bolivarian Revolution, in 2012, in his last political testament, he said commune or nothing. Basically, he was calling upon us, on the people of Venezuela and possibly the world too, the commune is an imperative. So that's what we will, that's what kind of like moves us to meeting here today and debating. I invite all of you to look for the book on the Monthly Review site, and of course the books of all the other panelists. I will be introducing each of the panelists one by one, and I will give each of them a 10-minute, each person will more or less make a 10-minute intervention. So Without further ado, we are going to move on to Bellamy Foster. He is a monthly review editor. He's the author of many books. A recent book that is actually quite relevant is Capitalism in the Anthropocene, Ecological Ruin and Ecological Revolution. And this book is actually relevant to our talks, as we will see. It's interesting that in 2011, John traveled with Mesados to Caracas to meet with Chavez, and Mesados was super important for Chavez. He really influenced Chavez in his conception of the commune. So I will start with some kind of like questions for John. John, you have talked about the possibility of communion age following the Capitolinian age. So what motivates you with that term, to use that term, right? And more importantly, what are the main features of the society of the communion age? What would be the relationship of human beings with non-human nature, or what you call the wider community? How would the ecological crisis be addressed in this new society? And well, where do we see some seeds for this future communal society? Thank you, John, again. John, I think you are muted.
The Anthropocene, of course, is our major problem because we're facing the possible extinction of humanity, and certainly it threatens an existential crisis for all of humanity. Hundreds of millions and billions of people threatened. And so everything we do has to be related to that. And the Anthropocene has generated a controversy over whether we should call it the Anthropocene, whether we should call it the Capitalocene or something else. Of course, scientists have decided on the notion of the Anthropocene because for the first time in the history of the Earth, a species, humanity is, well, the first time human species is becoming the driver of the entire Earth system. And this is a fundamental change that began in the 1950s. But if we recognize that we're in this predicament, there's the question of what is the first age of the Anthropocene? Because every geological epoch has an age that is attached to it. Actually, usually 3 ages. So Carl Soriano, and at the same time, virtually the same time, Brett Clark and myself designated the first age of the Anthropocene as the Capitolian or Capitolinian. But then there's the question of what comes after, because we're going to remain in a situation where we control the destiny of the planet to some extent. That is, we control our own destiny. We either drive ourselves into extinction or not. And as long as industrial civilization survives, we will be in that position. So the Capitolian represents the age dominated by capitalism and a destructive relation to the earth. And we've argued that by around 2050, we have to be creating a different relation to the earth, the Communion. Clark and I have argued in which we create a sustainable relation to the earth. But that's only possible if we have communal social relations. We can only create a community with the earth, sustainable human development, if we also have a society of substantive equality, what Meseros called substantive equality. Substantive equality and ecological sustainability come together, and they're only possible in a society and a geological age where we have a more communal relation to the earth. But it's no accident that we chose the term communion to talk about what has to exist ecologically if we're going to have a sustainable relation to the planet, because that goes back to Marx. Marx and Engels basically saw socialism in terms of communal relations, and they saw that more and more as their work developed. And so they talked constantly about communal relations, communal exchange, particularly in the Grundrisse, about communes, community. This is the direction that socialism had to go in the classical Marxist conception. So we were building on that, but also on the work of Istvan Mészáros, particularly his Beyond Capital. And Mészáros argued that we had to create a communal system. He had his fundamental chapter, which influenced Chavez enormously, was called the communal system and the law of value. And of course, it's the most difficult chapter in the book, but it emphasizes the need to create socialism around communal relations, around communal exchange, and to reject the law of value of capitalism. And that means that the relations have to be oriented in terms of time, in terms of activities, in terms of communal needs, in terms of use values. Basically, the notion of communal exchange in a communal society has a whole different notion of exchange and production, in which communal needs are the priority, and what we exchange are activities and use values, and we exchange time. We distribute disposable time on a collective communal basis, and so on. And so it ends up being a fundamentally different system than capitalism. As Chris Gilbert explains in his book, it's a system where decisions are not made ex post by the mediation of the market, but they're made ex ante through communal planning and organization, addressing needs directly. Now, Mészáros's analysis was built around the notion of social metabolic reproduction, which he took from Marx's notion of social metabolism as it was used in the Grundrisse. And the idea was that that the system of capital is not to be understood as a simplistic relation between labor and capital, but you have to look at his entire organic system with interconnections. If you just focus on one connection, you're going to fail. You have to create the entire system of reproduction. And that was articulated by Chavez based on Mészáros most succinctly in terms of the elementary triangle of socialism, which meant, consisted of first social ownership, second social organization of production by workers, and third satisfaction of communal needs. And if you dealt with all these different areas simultaneously, you would be able to create a communal system that had a social metabolic reproduction that was antithetical to capitalism and that represented a system of sustainable human development. And so Mészáros, rather abstractly and philosophically, developed these ideas, and Chavez started putting them into practice and giving them a more political significance. And I was part of the conversations at the time. I spent a lot of time with Mészáros, and we communicated a lot. And of course, Mészáros was spending time with Chavez. in 2011, I went to Venezuela because I was invited by the government. Chavez was going to, immediately after the election, he was going to push for the communes in a big way. And that was the agenda at the meeting. It was a small group of intellectuals with the government, and Chavez was setting the agenda. Except when I arrived, he was on television, and as he was walking over to join us, he had his first collapse, and so he wasn't present at that meeting, and we went over a lot of it and understood what the project was, but it wasn't until later on, when he was, when at the very end of his life, in his very last speech, the El Golpe speech, that he raised the issue front and center, insisted that it was commune or nothing, which is the subject of Chris's book. So this is a complex analysis. What I think is important to understand is that Chavez was a major theorist as well as a politician, and he was working with one of the major, I would say, the leading Marxist philosopher at this part of the late 20th, early 21st century, István Mészáros, and they were delving deeply into the whole Marxist tradition in order to create an alternative, a new path to socialism, based on the communal state, as it was called at one point, and then the commune, the whole notion of building the communes. And I thought that this was the most pioneering, really successful attempt to introduce a new path to socialism in our time that wasn't simply applicable to Venezuela, but applicable to struggles for socialism everywhere. That this, of course, every country has its own vernacular traditions, its own paths. The conditions differ, but I came to believe that the Bolivarian emphasis on the communal state and the communes was a radically different path to socialism, and really closer to what our ultimate goals should be, and a new strategy that really works in all sorts of ways. Of course, Venezuela has not been free to introduce this strategy as it would have liked. First, Chavez died, and the whole country came under the hybrid warfare of the United States, and yet, as Chris explains in his book, that made the communes even more important, and it meant that they represented a revolutionary strategy which could go forward in these conditions. And I want to just end with a principle that Mészáros always emphasized, and Chavez too, that the revolution has to be made irreversible in order to succeed. And the only way you can make it irreversible is to base it in the people themselves and their communal needs and activities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. It is indeed extraordinary to live in Venezuela and to see communes as they take shape. So it's great to hear your reflections and also from your experience with Mészáros. Next, we go to Emmy O'Brien. She's author of Family Abolition, Capitalism, and the Communising of Care. She's also the co-author of Everything for Everyone, an oral history of the New York Commune, 2052 to 2072. And she has reflected extensively on these issues, So thank you, Michelle, for being here with us. In Everything for Everyone, it depicts the emergence of a new society based on communes and that emerge following a series of disasters and wars, right? And um, in your work, in your other work, on family abolition, you posit the commune as the alternative, as an alternative to social reproduction unit that will substitute the family, right? So, why did you focus on social reproduction rather than production, which would have been the most common Marxist trope, perhaps? And if you can, and why does it help you define the future commune the future to talk about communes? If we could talk about that, we would be really grateful.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the organizers of this panel and People's Forum for hosting, and Chris Gilbert for writing an excellent book that provides the beginnings, the frame for us to be meeting here today. So I'm going to be speaking for about 10 minutes. I have to get off early, so I might not be joining the discussion later, and my apologies for that. It's certainly no lack of enthusiasm for this event. So as Sarah alluded to, I have two books, and they're sister books. They're very closely related to each other. One is fiction, one is nonfiction, and they both are concerned with the commune as a sort of central object of theorizing. So the first book I co-authored with a man, Al-Dahadi. It's called Everything for Everyone, an Oral History of the New York Commune, 2052 to 2072. It came out in 2022 with Common Notions Press. And so I'll tell you a little bit about the conceit of the book and some of our thinking that went into it, and read perhaps a couple of lines and then move on to the other book. So Everything for Everyone is a fictional collection of fictional oral histories with people in the future about their personal involvement in the world historical events of a global communist revolution when it finally arrives in New York City. And so me and a man play ourselves as very old ladies. It's 2072. And we are going around interviewing various people, being like, so where were you during the insurrection of Hunts Point and the People's Assembly of Crotona Park and the liberation of the MDC jail in Lower Manhattan, and, sort of people telling their stories. And they're people, it'd be New York, people come from all over the world. And then second chapter is about the liberation of Palestine. And given the current genocide in Gaza, activists are rereading this chapter partially for solace and inspiration. And you learn about the Civil War in the Midwest between from a very traumatized indigenous militant. And you learn about the fascist cults that ran Staten Island, and learn about the explosive growth of revolutionary activity around the world and in New York City. And it being oral histories, there's this sort of seamless move back and forth between the psychological and the rhythms of the person's speech. Many of the characters are highly traumatized. The world enters into some very dark periods in the 2040s. And the sort of broad historical sweep. So you get this sort of like people's idiosyncratic and personal reflections on the kind of structural transformations that they've witnessed. So as an example, the first interview is with Miss Kelly. Miss Kelly is a Black trans sex worker who lives in Hunts Point, and she's based partially on many activists who I have been really deeply inspired by and have been my political mentors. I'm trans, and I moved to New York City in 2004 to work at a syringe exchange program in Hunts Point, and did a lot of outreach to sex workers in the neighborhood, and have been in and out of sex worker movements and trans liberation movements ever since. So at one point I asked Miss Kelly, what does the commune mean to you? She says, it means we take care of each other. It means everything for everyone. It means we communized the shit out of this place. It means we took something that was property and we made it life. And I ask, there's the commune where you live, but also the commune of the whole region. And she says, yeah, I started to see that as we took over making sure everyone got fed. So the sex workers play a leading role in the Hunts Point commune that is launched with the takeover of the produce market there in 2052. She says that it was all in layers, that me and the girls could help take care of those hauling the food in and out, that they could take care of the borough could take care of the city could take care of the whole region, and the region could take care of us. It's all the commune, it's all for everyone. It took a lot of fighting and a lot of dying, and every day it seemed impossible, but we made it through. Somehow we made it through. And so the response from Everything for Everyone was quite remarkable, the kind of outpouring of enthusiasm for it. And neither Amanda nor I are fiction writers, but there was just tremendous interest and tremendous enthusiasm for the book. Oh, I have 3 minutes left. So I will move on to Family Abolition. So Family Abolition is a sister book. It's a nonfiction theorizing of a history of the family under racial capitalism. And there's a number of different components to the argument, but the one that's most relevant for us today is it has a speculative component, theorizing the commune as an institution that could replace the family as the primary unit of social reproduction without consolidating social reproduction activities primarily into the state or into the market, which I think there are good reasons for avoiding both. And so the commune is a way of theorizing revolutionary transition in the book and thinking about, particularly I draw from the communization tradition. And then also I'm really interested in what I call insurgent social reproduction. So these are the communal forms of social reproduction that emerge in the midst of militancy and insurgency, when large numbers of working class people are in direct rebellion against the state and capital. What kind of strategies do they actually use to reproduce themselves? So I opened with the example of the Oaxaca commune in 2006 and thinking about women cooking and taking care of their kids and serving coffee, living on the barricades, defending their neighborhoods against nightly attacks by paramilitaries, and women taking over the radio stations and this whole rebellion that unfolded in Oaxaca. And similarly, like I look at how social reproduction happens at protest camps. So the commune, rather than being a deliberate plan, a blueprint that's sort of imposed, or being necessarily the deliberate collective housing arrangements that I grew up, spent a lot of time in my young adulthood, the commune is actually emerging from the social reproduction of protest camps themselves. That this insurgent social reproduction that's sustaining the protests requires collectivizing social reproduction. That the nuclear household is very poorly suited to enabling people to protest. And so neither book is a dismissal of the need to collectivize production or think about communism in terms of production, but I feel like there's been a lot more extensive theorizing and attention to that over time, and that the social reproduction theory has been very powerful for beginning to draw attention to all these other forms of labor that go into the reproduction of people, and that both books are sort of a contribution to trying to think about what communism means in those terms. So thank you again to everyone who's involved in this, and it's really been a great pleasure to read Chris Gilbert's book, and Kale Akuno and Bellamy Foster have been big inspirations for me for a long time. So I think I'm out of time.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And in the chat, in the comments, somebody is asking, Barry is asking if the commune is a viable strategy. And I think that that's a very relevant question. We have seen them working here in Venezuela, but not everybody is here in Venezuela. So we will now move on to, we will transition to two really existing communal movements. One which is related to the book that has been mentioned, the Commune or Nothing book, that being Venezuela, Bolivarian Revolution. And the other one, the Jackson-Kush Plan and Cooperation Jackson in the Black Belt of the US South. So we will begin with Kali Akuno. Kali is a spokesperson for Cooperation Jackson. He is the co-author of Jackson Rising Redux. He's also, we know, writing a new book, and we are really looking forward to that. So Kali, I wanted to ask you, since, well, Cooperation Jackson started in 2014. It basically centers on combating racial capitalism while constructing, well, new social relations. And basically, the question I wanted to ask you is, can you explain the project's strategy and specifically how it appeals to the commons and to common property? Thank you, Kali, for being here with us tonight.
No, thank you all for hosting this. Really kind of putting some threads back together in many respects, some of which what I mean by that I'll come to. But to start with the question, because we could talk about this for hours on end. I think all of us could in many respects. The root of kind of our commons-oriented approach, first and foremost, starts with our community land trust. And that's the Fannie Lou Hamer Community Land Trust, which is stewarded by Cooperation Jackson. And we currently have over 40 different properties in West Jackson that are part of our community land trust. There are several houses which are being occupied as a housing cooperative. And then there are several commercial spaces that are being utilized by various co-ops and community-oriented businesses. And then there's several land parcels which are being utilized by our Freedom Farms co-op to help us move on the objective of food sovereignty within our community. But I want people, and I'm glad you mentioned the Jackson Kush plan, I want people to kind of take a little step back and put us within the heart of a broader strategic plan. And that's the plan that was just mentioned by Circle, the Jackson Kush plan. And I think it's important to cite some of the intellectual and movement history that kind of led to that, and what I meant by coming back to some circles. So if it's not known to the audience, I'm going to make it known that the Bolivarian revolutionary process was very instrumental in our development, right? When I was a member of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, we were very much in touch, particularly with the Afro-Venezuela network, and large portions of our work were kind of field tested and learned from studying and being able, various of our members being able to go to Venezuela and see many of the cooperatives and see many of the communes that were beginning to form in the early 2000s. And so we drew a lot of our work, our model, our theory from those models. And myself, also as being one of the key kind of writers and articulators and theorists behind those works. Just to let everyone here know, I was glad to hear Mazzaro's name invoked because it was his work, Beyond Capital, which for me, along with W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, those were two of the three works that really provided a clear strategic foundation and theoretical foundation for what you see in the Jackson Kush plan. And it formed, that work in particular, Beyond Capital, really underscored the aims and objectives of what we've been trying to both accomplish and operationalize to the greatest extent possible in Jackson through the vehicle of Cooperation Jackson within the overall context of trying to execute the Jackson Kush plan. And for those of you who don't know what that plan is, it was, I think it's important to historicize this, that the public version of that plan came out in 2012. And this was a year before the unfortunate passing of President Chavez. And we had been in some dialogue with various forces in Venezuela and showing the work even prior to give folks feedback on how this might work, where it might fit in to some overall global strategy to give people advice in terms of, how do we anchor this within a broader anti-capitalist context, within a broader anti-capitalist movement. We took our charge. I know I did very personally. I was at the social forum that was held in Venezuela in 2007, where Chavez put out the challenge of where is this going, right? And that it needs to go in a particular direction, particularly a socialist, eco-socialist direction. That challenge was put out. And then I think we tried to start answering that and bringing that movement to the United States. And we took this notion that we had to start where we had our strength within the Jackson community, and build and transform the relations there, and to try to democratize the community to the greatest extent possible. So we adopted this notion of participatory and antagonistic democracy that we try to bring and make instrumentals to the other major component of the Jackson Kush Plan, which is the People's Assembly, and to pursue the context of seeking to hold office within the municipality, to push the contradictions to the greatest extent possible, with an understanding that to hold office, particularly within the United States, that you cannot manage the contradictions of capitalism, and that fundamentally within the bourgeois order and society is what that means, to try to manage those contradictions. So we said we aren't trying to manage them, we're going to try to heighten them, and to use all the instruments, both of the formal kind of government space, but also throughout the People's Assembly, to agitate and to make all the vital questions about how do you actually govern a community, to make those mass questions, to kind of upend the various relationships of power within the state of Mississippi and the United States government, to challenge it and to move us closer towards self-determination and sovereignty, which is some core aims and objectives of our particular movement and project. So you have to situate cooperation, Jackson, within all of that. And I'm just saying this in brief, but you have to situate us within that. And what we are trying to do is to hold property, starting with land, in common, to create new methods of in relations of production that focus in on improving the quality of life, not trying to maximize profit, and to come up with new techniques to not only improve the overall quality of life, but to situate as much as possible all the means of production into the community's hands. And we are doing that through a process of what we call community production, which is using the tools and techniques of digital fabrication to try to come up with appropriate technology. And for us, that means not only utilizing technology that we ourselves can own and control, but to utilize technology to produce use values that service community needs, that eliminate all the unnecessary waste and ecological damage that's caused by the capitalist productive process and relations. So these are some of the fundamental things that Cooperation Jackson is really concentrating on. And to answer one of the final questions, is the commune possible and viable? Our answer to that is yes, and it can be under a variety of different types of circumstances and contexts. It's just a matter of, I think, trying to figure out the applications that work in your space, time, and conditions, and to operationalize those to the greatest extent possible with mass community support.
That's great, Cali. Thank you so much. Of course, being here in Venezuela, we always look to the project with a great deal of admiration and, of course, a feeling of sisterhood, brotherhood. So now we are going to turn to Venezuela, to the second actually existing communal experiment here that we are talking about today, there are actually communes that work in Venezuela. Going back to this question that has been asked on the chat, we see them actually working. So we'll talk more about them. Chris will be talking more about them. So Chris Gilbert is author of Commune or Nothing, the book that we've mentioned a couple of times, and that also gives the name to our panel today. It's published by Monthly Review Press. He's professor of political studies at Venezuela's Bolivarian University in Caracas. And he is co-author of Venezuela, The Present as Struggle, a book that we actually co-authored. Chris, your book, Commune or Nothing, looks at the communal project that emerged under the auspices of the Bolivarian Revolution. Of course, Chavez comes to power in '98, but it is in 2006 that Chavez begins to talk about socialism. In 2009, that Chavez proposes the Commune as the path to socialism. And it's in 2012 when he says Commune or Nothing, Comuna or Nada, which is for us, for those of us who are here in Venezuela committed to the communal project, kind of like a very powerful 3 words, a very powerful motive for working. So your book includes the accounts of some 8 individual communes, while it looks also at the history and the deep roots of the project. Communes are not something new. In short, you present also a theory of the commune. So, Chris, if you can explain the book's theoretical theorization of the commune as a strategic building block for the new communist society. And thank you for being here today.
Thanks. It's great to have this opportunity to talk with everybody about the commune. I guess I think we, perhaps in an aleatory manner, happened upon a good subtitle for the program because it's called Communes Against Capitalism. I mean that because one common thread that's been running through people's discussions has been strategy, and obviously it's not just because we have some enthusiasm for communes. It's rather that communes seem to be a viable strategy for overcoming capitalism. So that's kind of the way I want to structure my brief intervention. You mentioned that there's a theory of the commune, and of course in my book, and there's yes, that's right. And like any self-respecting theory, it's a theory that's based on reality, abstracts from reality, and it's also a theory that I think has potential to return to reality with a critical perspective, and maybe I'll get to that at the end, or maybe I'll have time to talk about that at the end. John mentioned Messeros, and actually Messeros enters in a second moment in my book. Obviously, Messeros is an earth, a before and after, an epic-making thinker. But I actually kind of tried to reconstruct a certain elements of the commune using value form theory and social reproduction theory. Those may seem to be an odd pairing, and probably most people aren't aware of value form theory. But just one takeaway from value form theory. Value form theory puts emphasis on how capitalist value is a social form. It's not just a magnitude or a substance. So once you start thinking about value as a social form, that in a way connects with social reproduction theory, because social reproduction theory is concerned with the totality of capitalist production, essentially how, capitalism, we don't only produce mercancías, commodities, but we also reproduce the labor force, we reproduce life. And you can see that those 2 elements of production are both structured by the value relation, if we see the value relation in an ample social sense. And so when I say the commune, my theory, to put it maybe isn't it slightly exaggerated language or theorization might be more appropriate. My theorization of the commune is essentially that the commune offers an integral solution to the problems of capitalism, precisely because it promises to abolish the whole range of value relations. And you can look at how that would change what's called productive work in current society, commodity producing work. On the one hand, that kind of work is generally in what I call indirectly social labor. It's labor that's mediated by the social. When in capitalist society we produce things in a social sense, it's part of a social relation, but it's not. But it's mediated by the market. Therefore, it's an indirectly social relation. And a commune proposes to end that indirect sociality. And as John was saying, it's an ex ante planning. In other words, you are producing knowing where it's going. And so that would have the possibility to end exploitation and alienation. The alienation that's always involved in capitalist commodity production, the sites of capitalist commodity production, which is an alienation that's exaggerated by the fact that, of course, in a capitalist society, people don't actually control the conditions of their production. But it also, this is where I say it's an integral solution to the problems of capitalism. the commune offers the possibility of taking reproductive labor out of the household or out of situations of oppression, unpaid, under-recognized reproductive labor, care labor, domestic labor. It offers to take it out of the sites of oppression and also bring it into a democratically controlled, bring it into the whole of democratically controlled, directly social labor. So that's why I say the commune is an integral solution to the problems of capitalism. And I think there's an increasing awareness in our time that capitalism is not only about exploitation, but it also incorporates a whole range of oppressions. So in some sense, I say, how else but by establishing communes can we overcome this whole range of oppressions, which includes exploitation, and it also includes the expropriation of the earth. Actually, in a later moment, the ecological and environmentalist theme is present throughout my book, but I explored it somewhat further in an article I wrote just this summer, in which I look at how communes offer the possibility of overcoming the ecological crisis too, precisely because they, one important thing they do, as Don was saying, is that they return production to use values, and they kind of connect production and consumption together so that production does not become this kind of treadmill of senseless production of often useless commodities. And another thing they do is they bring, precisely by abolishing the kind of hierarchical separation of productive and reproductive labor and bringing them into a democratically organized totality, that should give greater protagonism to the production of life, the reproductive labor, which generally has a smaller ecological footprint. So that's the kind of totalizing view. And I was saying this, of course, is related to and directly related to one's experience in Venezuela, also borrowing on reflections from Masaros and other people. One thing that I was saying is a common theme through everybody's intervention has been the theme of strategy. And Sita, when you were presenting the theme of communes, of course, it's important that one of the unique things about Venezuela, special things about our situation here, is that the commune is part of a strategy of socialist construction that strategy has been developing over the course of the process, which now has more than 20 years of existence. And as people perhaps know, that the process originally, Chavez was elected initially pursuing a kind of third way socialism, but it was radicalized over time. There was, after 2002, there was the process was declared anti-imperialist. Then it declared itself socialist around 2006. And then in 2009, the commune emerges. But the impressive thing here is that the commune is part of this. It's a building block, or Chavez would sometimes say a cell. It's a cell in a body. And so it's important for us to think about that now, because a commune in itself is not necessarily revolutionary. In fact, like the kibbutz can actually be a counter-revolutionary settler colonialist proposal. So, and Chavez actually said this in the famous moment. He said, an isolated commune is counter-revolutionary. And he meant that it's important to be part of a strategic development that goes forward towards socialism. One little thing I want to add to that is the importance of history. I think that and that actually enters in both the work of Kali and Michel, the importance of recovering emancipatory traditions and going forward with them. I have a particular take on that, which I think is actually integral to the Bolivarian process. The Bolivarian process is called the Bolivarian process precisely because it tries to recover the legacy of Bolivar and take it forward in the present. And that, of course, has a specific bearing on the commune, because the commune in Venezuela reaches back to Maroon traditions of emancipation here, Maroon resistance here in Venezuela. Maroon communities were called Cumbes. And there's also a huge indigenous legacy of communal resistance and communal self-governed autonomies here. So the commune here must connect with and carry those forward. That's actually one of the more perhaps exotic to some readers. Will find that my reference to what I call revolutionary romanticism, because for me, romanticism is about this revolutionary use of the past to go forward, which I would actually say is quite common, not exotic at all in the Bolivarian process. And it's actually integral to a way of thinking, a form of revolutionary historiography that uses the past to go forward, appeals to it as a kind of counter. I see it as almost a necessary solution, or it's like an Ariadne's thread to lead us out of the labyrinth of the idea that capitalism itself might be progressive. The last thing I was going to say was about the critical potential of theory. I think that any theory should allow you to come back. You take a theory as an abstraction from reality, and then it allows you to go back and apply it to reality and see how reality holds up to it. And In this case, in my book, I developed a theory in the first chapters, and then of course there are these chapters that are kind of chronicles of visits to the communes. And at the end, there's some moments in which I attempt to apply the theory critically to the communes. And one sense in which I do that is ask the question, in what sense are the communes actually advancing towards socialism? Which that necessarily means part of the strategic element is that the communes have to work to hegemonize the whole economy, the whole society, and they also have to work towards the abolition of the state. And I explore that in the different efforts to do that and to what extent it's succeeded. And all one can say for now is it's a highly contested field. The other thing, of course, is this question about the reproductive labor. To what extent have the communes actually emancipated social reproductive labor, which of course is a typical site of gender oppression and racial oppression. And there's a mixed record on that with some curious things, like one commune has actually made it part of its discourse. But so far, it's not actually the commune that's probably made the most concrete steps. But my general sense is that there's still a long way to go in that area in the effort to emancipate social reproductive labor. So that pretty much rounds up what I want to say in this first intervention. I'll be interested to know what we can say in the discussion period about the theme of communes and what we have in common about that, which I think is a great deal.
Thank you so much, Chris. Now we are going to open for a second round. So everybody is going to be joining us here on the screen. Oh, that's wonderful. Michelle is here. So we thought that she might have to leave, but she's here. So what we were thinking is that we would each take a round of 5 minutes, because of course we probably just touched the tip of the iceberg in relation to our each person's reflections on the issue of the communes, right? So if each person wants to add a little bit more or respond to each other's comments, there's also some comments. There's a comment that we have more or less read from Nicolas Vargas about the commune not being viable, but also he connects it to the issue of the state. So that is one question that could be addressed, but I will also maybe be throwing in some other questions soon in between the different rounds. So I guess we'll go first. I don't know, Michelle, if you have to leave, or maybe we go with you now and then we pick up with John.
Sure. I won't take my full 5 minutes because I do have to pop off. But these presentations are really wonderful, and I think they, particularly Kali and Chris, are drawing attention to the strategic value of the commune as a practical activity under even in the conditions of racial capitalism, and it's a strategy of resistance. And that intrigues me, and it's quite different in my work. The kinds of communes, as we sometimes call them, that I grew up in were collective housing arrangements, in punk and anarchist communities. And I became quite cynical about their sort of revolutionary potential in a meaningful sense. But I liked the collectivization of household labor. And in my work, I theorize the commune as the emergence of a communist society. So as necessarily entailing the overthrow of racial capitalism, the destruction of the state, the collectivization and communizing of means of production, and that as a unit of social reproduction, it really lends itself to collective self-governance, to mass participation in the management of society. And so I think about the sort of commune as a revolutionary unit of social reproduction that emerges in a communist context. And so my link, I see in the Q&A, someone was arguing that I was conflating the assembly and the commune. The link is that I don't know how to get there. And these works and Cooperation Jackson and the Bolivarian project in Venezuela are very exciting and I think worth paying very close attention to. I don't know how to get there and don't claim to have a revolutionary strategy, but the collectivization that does happen in the midst of sustained rebellions, I think is worth paying very close attention to. And I would argue that the moments of family abolition happen in the context of sustained rebellions. And that's part of what makes them so transformative for their participants, so joyful, and one of the only things that makes rebellion sustainable in any particular sense. They cannot be sustainable unless they're victorious, but that the extent to which they're able to collectivize social reproduction is about meeting people's collective needs and care needs while in rebellion, while in struggle, in a way that's able to sustain the struggle moving forward. So the extent to which I sort of try to draw a link between the future and the present, those are the points of the present that kind of really interest me. So I guess I'll just close out with a couple of questions for Kali and Chris in particular. And so both of you, are talking about communes in the present. And I'm wondering particularly how consumption works, right? So cooperative labor is a very important part, as I understand, of what's happening in cooperation Jackson and in Venezuela. But communes or nothing makes the distinction between the commune and the cooperative, the commune as a site, including of collective consumption and social reproduction. And so I'm thinking I'd love to hear in more concrete terms what that actually looks like in people's lives. So thank you, everyone. And I'll keep listening, but have to pop off.
Thank you. So we will go with John. And by the way, John, of course, as we know, new Meseros, and there's a fair amount of people asking about Meseros also, how to read Meseros, because it's indeed very hard to read Meseros. So John, if you want to go ahead.
Yes. Well, I was thinking in terms of what everyone said, and I'm learning a great deal from our discussion. But I was thinking about how in the strike at the helm speech at the end, Chavez insisted on commune or nothing. And Chris talks about that in his book. But it was really very remarkable. He's saying that this is the only path, the only viable path and strategy in Venezuela, at least, to create a socialism. And in saying the commune or nothing, he was implicitly saying that the state had to direct its resources to the communes. It had to direct its resources to the population organized on that basis, that communes had to be set up almost like the pores of a new society. And the state had a role in this, but it also meant, in a sense, at least for Meseros and I think for Chavez as well, it meant a kind of long-term withering away of the state and creating the communes as another political basis. So this is something that I think is very, very important, and that came up in the discussion that Chris mentioned at the end, the whole issue of the withering away of the state, which doesn't mean eliminating political organization. It means eliminating the state as an alienated body above society, controlling society. And the only way to really create substantive democracy, I think Chavez came to believe, and to create socialism was by basing it in the commune. So I think it's very important to try to think all of that as connected, and that the communes themselves represent a new way of organizing the entire political structure of society. But it can't be a single commune. It can't be a single commune. As Chris said, they have to be integrated. It has to be developed as a much larger social project. And this reminds me of how Marx dealt with the Paris Commune. All of these things are brought together, and it's surprising to me that Chavez initiated that call and insisted on Maduro, and particularly carrying it out, and that it actually happened, that the communes did grow in this period. It's very remarkable. And if you looked at the strike at the helm speech, you will find that Chavez was criticizing the members of the government who were actually hesitating. They were not really buying into his notion of the commune. And so his strike at the helm speech was really a very frank criticism aimed at the government, speaking to the people, but also looking at the contradictions within the Bolivarian process and state. And that was something that I witnessed, or at least had a sense of, when I was there in 2011 with the government. They weren't all buying into the commune. And maybe the government never really did, but they gave enough resources, enough legitimation to allow populations, the people themselves, to take this into their hands and create something new. So it's a very remarkable process. Thank you.
So we go with Kali. If you want, Michelle also left some questions there for you, or if you want to make any reflection in relation to the interventions by other folks on the panel. Kali, I think you are muted.
I said, I'm making a request that we have to do this again.
Has to be done.
Because, every question would take some time to really unpack.
That's right.
But let me say, I think relative to Michelle's question, it's I would say our view that the commune and the cooperatives should be distinct and viewed distinctly, but they have to be interconnected. And for us, that I think that we have learned, particularly from elements of our experience through the pandemic, that they have to be both theoretically kind of connected, but then more importantly, practically connected. And the question around social reproduction, like that is key to this permanence that you spoke to earlier, right? And I think John was speaking about how do we make this permanent? A lot of times, the explosion of mutual aid and the explosions in the experiments that we see in broad radical kind of communal practices and democratization. One of the reasons that they're not able to sustain themselves for long periods of time, because they don't pay adequate attention to these social reproductive questions, right? And it's only really, we would say in our experience, building upon that you can make it permanent, and you have to collectivize that. And a lot of the defaults wind up happening, like when they return back primarily to their kind of quote unquote, I hate that word, but I'm gonna use it in this context, the traditional kind of gendered practice and expression, right? And we're not able to sustain the broad holding of the space of, who's going to take care of the children, who's minding and taking care of the elderly, right? Who is making sure that there's healthcare, there's food production, there's these things that enable us all to participate, right? And to show up and be at our fullest in any engagement. That work is going to have to be done by somebody, and we have to create structures and practices and processes to make sure that that doesn't fall upon the same people who traditionally are excluded to those particular roles and how they've been genderized, throughout the course of, I'm not going to say history, because in no society pre-capitalist era was exactly the same. That sometimes get generalized. But in this more common era, the colonial era and the elements of what are now being called the post-colonial era, where there's a more standard dynamic structured around capitalist relations that we all are kind of embedded in. And one of the things that we've been trying to both put in practice and theorize to kind of do some of this operationalize it, is what we call the build and fight formula on our end. So I'll just do a little introduction of that. And what we're most interested here is making an argument, primarily to left forces in North America, primarily the United States, and Canada, but further afield, that we kind of have to move out of this kind of deficit mentality and thinking that we don't have enough, or there are not enough people involved in the movement, quote unquote, and to ask folks to kind of step back and look at all the things that we are doing that are rooted in concrete practice in regards to mutual aid, in regards to efforts at food security that could lend themselves towards projects of food sovereignty, worker self-organization in various forms, that we have to put those different pieces together. And one of the underscoring things that has to link those are very deliberate and intentional practices of social reproduction that form a glue, or could form a glue and have to form a glue, to enable the liberatory potential of our self-organization around these things, to remove us from capitalist relations of production, particularly those aiming towards the production of commodities, more towards the production of various use values that we can exchange amongst ourselves very intentionally and deliberately, which will require higher degrees of planning. And that is where, for us, one of the core components of this build and fight formula are you can call them people's assemblies or kind of planning councils. But those elements are going to be needed in order for us to really realize the potential of the commune. And cooperatives to us, just so folks are clear, cooperatives to us fit into this realm of worker self-organization. And we see that cooperatives are just one form of worker self-organization. There are other forms that have to be utilized in different contexts and in environments, but they have to come together and work in complementary ways. And so one of the pieces that we've been kind of pushing for since our beginning, right, is trying to, in the U.S. context, trying to reunite the labor movement, the trade union movement, with the cooperative movement, and not have them view each other as competitive forces against each other, but things that need to complement each other. And we're trying to push, in particular, trade union movement to think beyond just contracts and working conditions, but to think about how do you democratize, all of the workspaces that we inhabit and have built. How do we democratize those to the fullest and make them common, if not communal, property, to be able to move us past capitalist relations of production? But we think that there's a process by how you go about engaging and building these communes. We think that has to kind of start on the local level, but it cannot and must not stay there because, as we know from our experience in the Deep South, facing the terror of white supremacy, those can be easily bombed out if they're not connected and federated in various ways to get us towards new relations and a new system of governance that I think will have to move to some degree towards, in phases, towards the withering of the state. I don't think that's going to happen, given our context, kind of automatically, but it's something we're going to have to be very intentional and deliberate about deconstructing at every step of the road.
Yes. Did you hear me on your end?
Yes.
Can I go? Okay. Yes. So now we go with Chris. Any comments, observations?
Sure, I'll try to weave together some comments together, and connect issues. To respond first to Michelle, the first thing about consumption, I think that I can dismiss with that quickly by saying there's only been an index of separation, both in the inside communes, demercantilizing the relation between production and consumption. Some communes, for example, offer products free, put their production to their inside the commune, and sometimes they offer them at what they call solidarious prices. And then there's of course different relations to the state. Sometimes the clapbags get distributed, or other state benefits get distributed through the communes. But there's a long way to go there. And likewise with the relation among communes, there's been this whole effort to make rutas of exchange, circuits of exchange among communes, and that's only incipient. So there's a long way still to go there. It's yet another sense in which the theory is not fully realized. The other thing I wanted to bring up is a more interesting, complicated issue that actually Michelle and I were exchanging emails before before the talk took place. And that's and to put it in a kind of a cliche sense, it's like part of the dialectic or the debate between spontaneity and strategy. I was interested that she used the word strategy in her presentation just now, but there's a sense in which there's more of an emphasis on spontaneous revolution, the importance of spontaneity, and a certain amount of skepticism, which I understand was actually reading her work on family abolition that introduced me to this tendency, the Teoria Communis tendency, and the Endnotes. And I guess in the Bay Area, there's a collective called Endnotes that pertains to the same general tendency. They have a great deal of skepticism about what they call programmatization, the way if you develop a program, it as I understand it, becomes a kind of straitjacket. And there's also tends to be a kind of like workerist projection of the future. And so the problem is that instead of abolishing the working class as Marx actually wanted, or was his proposal, it ends up being a kind of workerist utopia, which is often a heteronormative or a machista utopia. And in addition to being a work utopia, which is not really the kind of utopia we want to live in. And as I was thinking about this debate we have, or implicit debate, because I do think strategy is necessary and is an important, kind of like a long-term strategy that's in a dialectic relation with spontaneity. I was thinking about a couple of arguments that I could put in favor of the importance of strategy, and how it's not the danger of what I understand to be programmatization or the workerist straitjacket is not so, can be avoided and is avoided in reality sometimes. And one of those things is the fact that strategy development, I always think that Marxism since about 1970 has been very weak on the question of strategy. And actually, in 1970, there was just kind of a ripple effect of certain debates that happened in the 20s and 30s after there was a kind of a period in which strategy was under considered. But one thing I think is important is that strategy is not, having a socialist strategy is not about having the tablets, 2 tablets or something. It's really about an iterative process of putting forward hypotheses. I was interested by Daniel Ben Said did some work on this, on thinking about the importance of socialist strategy. And the idea of a hypothesis put forward as an experiment, and that's always been central to the Bolivarian process. So their strategies developed through an iterative process, and Chavez liked to say, inventamos or erramos, we invent or we make errors. But in fact, he should have said, we invent and we make errors. So there's a feedback relation. In fact, the communal strategy here evolved out of that kind of feedback, experimenting with state-run projects, and then adapting that to trying cooperatives, and then going to another option that relied more fully on Mesauros' ideas. The other thing I want to say about that is a little bit more perhaps abstruse, and it has to do with my notion about historiography. I think all of us here recognize the importance of appealing to the past in some way or another, the history of struggles. And with my notion of kind of romantic historiography, I understand that relation to be complicated. When you pick up a revolutionary tradition, you're not just it's not mere continuity. It's more like what Walter Benjamin said, a jump. He said the tiger's leap from the past to the present, because bourgeois historiography is always gradualist. And there's also a curious, I would say, surreal effort of the imagination. And when I say surreal, I can explain it in a very pedestrian sense. I think that when Chavez, said Bolivar is going to walk through Bolivar is going to lead us, or he revived different figures from the past, Juana la Avanzadora, Manuela Sanz, and Simon Bolivar. That was essentially a kind of surreal gesture, like waking up from a dream and creating what Walter Benjamin calls a dialectical image. So I think that sense of like a freedom dream, what Robin Kelly calls a freedom dream, that those surreal jumps of the imagination. And I actually think that when Lenin said Soviets plus electricity, that was a little bit like the Comte de Lautréamont talking about the sewing machine and the umbrella being hooked together, or even the hammer and sickles, another kind of surrealist coming together of two things. So I think the role of the imagination, the role of an iterative process in developing a strategy can avoid some of these errors that are perceived or correctly in many cases by the teoria communiste tendency. I want to turn to John. John reminded me of the rapidness or the shortcomings of my exposition. In a sense, I talked about the strategy, but I didn't really talk about there is a clear strategy in relation to the state, and it can be laid out with clarity. And that would be saying that Messeros believed that, and it's interesting how this plays out in Corporation Jackson as well, a similar model. You had to make an intervention, a political intervention. You had to take part of the state or take the government over. And then from there, but the key focus would be reorganizing the social metabolism in the society. And you can't really abolish the state right from the start, because the state, in some very basic sense, the state itself or alienated social relations are an effect of the alienated social metabolism. So there has to be a relatively long process of changing the social metabolism through establishing communal relations. And that's what will lead to the state ultimately being abolished. One thing that John said that reminded me of our own experience in Venezuela, he was pointing out how, Chavez died saying Commune or nada, commune or nothing. And it turned out to be right, but it didn't turn out to be right exactly the way he imagined. I think that's part of the dialectic of history, because in fact, it's because of the government, and I'm not criticizing the government directly about this. The government, in fact, turned its back on the communal project for pragmatic reasons. Some people say they were doing a kind of new economic policy. But precisely in the moment in which the Commune was reborn with most force, that was the moment in which they were kind of abandoned. And I think that actually is a fascinating thing. Probably some watchers will know about Rebecca Solnit's book, Paradise Built in Hell, which looks at the way disaster situations create mutual aid. And Kali just mentioned that right now, how mutual aid emerges in a crisis situation, but the problem is sustaining it. And so that's exactly what happened here. Right in the worst moment, in the book, I appeal to the saying of Dickens, who wasn't a revolutionary, but he sometimes had apt expressions. He said, "The best of times, the worst of times," is a kind of description of the revolution. And so that's what it was. It was the worst of times and the best of times. It was the worst of times in material sense. Many people died. But at the same time, it was a moment in which mutual aid grew, communes grew. And so now the problem becomes, and that's kind of one of the things Kali was pointing to, is exactly how do you sustain it? How do you sustain the initial moment, the initial surge? So we were saying sometimes in the past months, we've been saying here, well, we survived the crisis, but how do we survive the recovery? They present serious challenges both ways. One thing I can say about strategy, and this is kind of like the destiny of third world revolutionaries, which is not a small thing, because most revolutions are third world revolutions. They start from the global south. Is that precisely the revolution happens both too early and too late. And then there's a moment of stagnation, partly because of imperialism, of blockades and things like that. And that's what, Che confronted that when in the Cuban Revolution, they declared socialism, then encountered enormous obstacles. And so that's kind of the situation we're all in. But I think there's no other way than to, through this iterative process, look for strategies, look for new inventions, inventamos or oramos. And the only thing I might end with, and perhaps I'm kind of like pulling things in my own interest as far as future investigations, I think that one of the problems people undervalue strategy precisely because they undervalue many people. I'm not saying the people in this panel, both Kali, John, and Michelle gives great protagonism to the global south in her books. Many people undervalue the work that was done on strategy, whether in China or in Venezuela, or in Cuba, as far as the way forward. And so one of the things I think I personally want to devote myself to is attempting to bring to light many of the strategies of socialist construction in the global south.
So now I know everybody must be a little bit tired, but I think we might have time to go over some of the questions that we have from the comments and maybe add some more reflections on each other's talks. So I'm going to read, and maybe I'll even answer or attempt to answer at least one of them, of the questions that we have from our audience. And thank you to everybody who's joining us. There's a very lively discussion on the comments section. So B. Cunningham and Yvonne, they both asked about the issue of tensions, and I think this may relate to the Venezuelan situation, about the issue of tensions between the state, the government, and the communes. Basically, B, who was here in the summer for a brigade with Code Pink, they think that they might have witnessed some contradictions between the state and the communes. So how is that addressed? That would be one of the questions. The other question several people ask about mesados. The folks from Monthly Review attempted to put some links there, but I think YouTube does not allow for links or something. So turn to the Monthly Review page for the books, for the Mesados books, as well as for Chris Gilbert's books. And finally, folks are asking about currencies and the control of the schools. Currencies that have emerged in the context of the Bolivarian process and the control of schools. Those are some of the questions that people have been asking. So this is a little bit open-ended. We are going to do a little bit kind of like freestyle. I'm going to do again the same kind of rounds. Each one of you 3 minutes, and then I'll perhaps add something at the end. So we'll go with John first. This will have to be pretty short. It will have to be 3 minutes. So John, go ahead. I think you are muted, John.
Sorry. I wanted to indicate how much I've learned from the discussions, and we're operating at different levels of analysis often, and yet it's all very unified from the ground level to the high theory. And I think that what you're seeing is a very comprehensive, critical approach that we've all brought some things to. Somebody asked in the comments what would be a good introductory book by Mészáros. I would recommend his book, The Necessity of Social Change, as the best way into his system. I was talking to him once about how difficult it was for people to read his work, and that we needed to create a book that was an introduction to his work, and that was how we did The Necessity of Social Change. So I would highly recommend that, and it is a good theoretical basis for a lot of things we're talking about, but ultimately these issues have to be approached at the ground level. And what I find is most valuable is how Chris's book has given us the history of the concrete struggles. And in terms of that, and of course, we're learning about Cooperation Jackson, which is something I've admired for a long time as well. And it's nice to see this is a concrete struggle over racial capitalism in the United States that offers hope. So we have a lot of work here and to rely on. And I would love to see Chris go on to write a book on all of the socialist strategies in the third world. I can't imagine anything more important today.
And we go with Kali.
Well, I'm just sitting there. I'm sorry, I was taking some notes. I'm learning a lot myself, and a lot to follow up on. But I can tell you from our experience that there are going to be contradictions, between our communes and experiments in the state, even when those states are allied or favorable. Again, that are rooted in are different, both locations relative to trying to deal with all of the impacts and effects of capitalism, and how the state projects, even on a municipal level, that we've been dealing with and help to occupy over various periods of time, which is going to come into different contradictions with it, right? It's a different set of interests, a different overall kind of relations that they have to deal with and what we have to deal with on the ground, right? So that should be anticipated. I think it's a deeper question that we're going to have to figure out, both theoretically and practically, like how do we deal with these contradictions in a way that we can continue to press the state to work in the favor of our processes, communal processes, without either consuming them or undermining them, right? And I don't think we don't have an answer to that particular question just yet. We are constantly experimenting with that, and how we've been, kind of moving the last couple of years is to just say we recognize that there is a space and a role that our comrades, who are occupying the government kind of offices that they have to play. And then there's a role that we have to play. And that one of the things that we have the obligation is to continue to push them to move towards the various, practices we think are necessary to abolish the various systems of oppression. And so that is kind of what we've been concentrating on. What is our particular role relative to moving this particular dynamic?
And we go back with Chris.
Yeah, I guess to pick up a little bit on the question of, I think that one of the main interests about contradictions is with regard to the state. And maybe I can try to just give a breaking news, talk about a breaking news, because that's all I can say is that's one of the key issues. And one thing that's emerged recently in the communes is the question of, actually, we sitting on together began to talk to communards about just applying a theoretical framework that has existed for 100 years almost now, what Preobrazhensky called primary socialist accumulation. And that's become a debate in the two most powerful communes right now. And for listeners, primary socialist accumulation is based on the idea that some people say that Marx imagined that arguably, for much of Marx's career, he imagined the revolution would take place in the so-called developed or the overdeveloped countries. And in fact, that didn't happen. So that means that revolutions tend to take place in countries that are short on productive forces. And there becomes an issue of how to develop those productive forces, which, according to maybe an orthodox view, would have been developed under capitalism, under a developed capitalism. So Preobrazhensky and Bukharin debated this 100 years ago, and it's actually quite a lively debate right now in Venezuela. And in Venezuela, of course, the terms are very transformed, because historically, Preobrazhensky proposed with a kind of impressive clarity and elegance that the only way to do primary socialist accumulation would be to expropriate the peasants. And Bukharin had a more complex view of things, which I would just call somewhat, it could be summarized perhaps muddling through using different forms of approaching the issue without this elegant and drastic expropriation of the peasants. And so right now that's being played, but as I say, the terms are changed, because here the historic idea is close to Preobrazhensky, but instead of the peasants funding the commune, the way to do it would be to the oil rent, the oil profits should be directed to the communes. And so that would come through the state and the state oil company. But on the other hand, that presents, so the debate was realized here, and just last night we were talking to some communards about how they're actually thinking of some kind of mixed solution to reduce their dependence on the state, and returning once again to a kind of small cooperatives that would be kind of satellite cooperatives around the commune, which would have communal production and its main centers of production, but there would be kind of like satellite cooperatives that would be part of this effort at socialist accumulation, more of a muddling through sort of issue. So all I can say is these are really lively debates. One can say, sometimes when I think about the revolution, you can think it's very exciting. Sometimes you can also think of, I remember Roque Dalton, the Salvadorian poet, said that the revolution was a giant headache and the communism would be a giant aspirin. So sometimes it can seem like a headache, but one hopes that the communism will bring us the giant aspirin. No. In fact, following a revolution is a fascinating experience and a nutrifying theory. And of course, it's, as Chavez said, it's the Communal nada, because there's of course an existential dimension to this. Because if we don't build a communal society, or what John, if we don't succeed in entering the Communian age, we will probably face planetary destruction.
Well, folks, I think that we finished. I think we finished on a very few wonderful interventions. I just very quickly, because of some of the questions, somebody was asking about currencies. Two communes have had currencies: El Panal Commune in Caracas and the Che Guevara Commune in Mérida, and they were both successful for a brief period of time. But of course, we live in a society that's still a capitalist society. In fact, Chavez often reminded us that we still have a bourgeois state in Venezuela. And that, of course, creates all sorts of contradictions, which comes to the questions that some of you were already answering, and I won't go into it. But the fact is that given that we still have a bourgeois state, then the struggle is still ongoing, right? So there's a government that's sympathetic, but sometimes more pragmatic, sometimes less pragmatic. There are contradictions between the communes and the state. And I guess the goal is to make the communal project hegemonic to overcome these contradictions. And at this moment, well, since 2017, as Chris was saying, since 2017, the communes have been definitely growing, which is really extraordinary. You know, like in the worst of times, when the US blockade really made our lives really, really horrendous, that's when communes kind of like picked up once again. So, but the truth is that these communes reemerge, but we still have to build a referent that will be hegemonic in our society. There's actually, I would say, a relatively small percentage of the Venezuelan society that is communalized. That's something that somebody was asking in the questions as well. So I'm looking to see if there's any other questions that should be urgently addressed. Somebody else was asking, it was actually a question for Cali, because he mentioned Afro-Venezuelan communities. Those are Black communities in Venezuela. That's what he was referring to, I think. And yeah, and people keep asking about mesaros. In addition to reading the books from Monthly Review, in Chris's book, there's a chapter that's called Mesaros and Chavez, the philosopher and the llanero. So that's also kind of like a reading, theoretical reading from Venezuela and from the actual existing practice of Chavez's influence on mesaros. So I think we will leave it there, because it's been a long evening, but very. I'm really happy. I think we've had a very good conversation, and as Kali was saying, I think we should do it. We should do it again, and I should not fail to thank Kate and the People's Forum who have actually been helping us with making today's space possible, in addition to Monthly Review. So any very short last words from you folks? I guess.
Let's do it again.
Okay.
This is round one, I think. Let's do it again.
Okay, sounds good. And John is muted. Muted again.
I gave the wrong title for the Mesaros book. It's The Necessity of Social Control. And I agree with Kali. We should do it again.
Yeah.
Agreed, and I'd love to.
Okay, well, sounds good. Good night, everybody. Remember, we are all with the people of Palestine, also with the people of Venezuela who have been living for already 8 years a brutal blockade. We call for everybody's solidarity, of course, primarily with the people of Palestine, but also with the people of Venezuela. And we will meet soon for sure. Thank you.
And Chris loved the book.
Thank you very much for talking with us.